Today, and for the rest of this course, we'll see how anthropological perspectives contribute ideas and insight on some of the biggest challenges facing humankind. From war and conflict to medicine, criminal justice, and health, anthropology has exciting contributions to share. And today, we're going to think about violence and conflict resolution. These are crucial themes for anthropologists, you see, because the United Nations and the U.S. military and intelligence agencies, they all agree. Our increasingly dynamic climate, along with growing populations, well, they're going to lead to increased conflict throughout the world. And in our modern age, war and violence, they kind of appear as an unavoidable aspect of the human experience. In fact, over the past 5,000 to 6,000 years or so, we've seen over 14,000 major wars, and millions of lives have been lost in these conflicts. But as an anthropologist, I know that these grim statistics, they're not the whole story. Because in addition to uncovering the roots of war, anthropology has important lessons to bring to the table when it comes to providing cross-cultural insight on conflict resolution. So today, we're going to see how anthropology can be a peacemaker, or at least a conflict manager. But first, let's return to the history of human violence to clear up three big myths about humans and their proclivity towards violence and war. Anthropology, with its four-field approach, can clear up three major myths about humanity and our so-called violent nature. 1, there has always been warfare. 2, we are biologically predisposed to violence. And 3, warfare is universal. Let's think about each one of those myths. First, have humans always been at war? Or is this form of organized violence more of a recent phenomenon? Well, as it turns out, war is a recent development in our human history. It's not really a long-standing practice. Homo sapiens, as we've learned, they've been around for around 200,000 years. But the archaeological record indicates that war, at least as we understand it today, it only emerged some 10,000 years ago, right around the advent of agriculture. Now, it would be an oversimplification to state that our foraging past was an era of peace and cooperation, but to some degree, that's some useful hyperbole. Let me explain. As we've learned in previous lectures, prior to our transition to agriculture, we fed ourselves by foraging and hunting. And this hunter-gatherer way of life, it shaped our social worlds. Specifically, it kept our communities small, and it leveled out inequality. We know that hunter-gatherer communities were much smaller than the farming-based societies that emerged within the past 10,000 years. Archaeologists and others, they note that bands of foragers typically maxed out at around 100 to 150 people. And in a society where everyone knows each other, if there's a slacker in our midst, we'll know it. You can't slide by in the shadows of a band of foragers. Furthermore, like a college student always on the move between dorm, home, and summer jobs, foragers, they were nomadic. They were always on the run. You see, they followed the food on seasonal migrations. And as non-sedentary people, they couldn't afford to invest in personal property or surplus. In a way, they had to restrict their earthly possessions and food stores to what they could carry. Compared with our overstuffed pantries today, foragers, they didn't have a place to store a few cans of soup for that rainy day. When they wanted soup, they had to start from scratch. So the survival of these small groups required a level of cooperation that made conflict counterproductive for all parties. Now, that's not to say that hunter-gatherers were peaceniks who never fought. But we are saying that these fights, or forager conflict, it rarely erupted into all-out war. Because non-sedentary people, they just can't afford to accumulate property the way we Westerners do today. They cultivated more communal lifestyles. In fact, we can observe this lifestyle even in contemporary hunter-gatherer societies. For example, anthropologist Marjorie Shostak, she lived among the San people of the Kalahari, and she recorded the life of a remarkable woman named Nisa. Now, when she recounts Nisa's childhood, she describes the emotional dimensions of growing up in this kind of sharing economy. I mean, she remembers, for example, how excited and proud she was when her father returned after a successful hunt. But knowing that that bounty would be shared with the whole community, she said it always stung just a little bit. You know, it's like any kid learning how to effectively socialize. Nisa's community taught her that feeding all bellies takes precedence over individual accumulation or surplus. And without that surplus or troves of private property, the incentive for war, well, it isn't eliminated, but it is greatly reduced. However, the agricultural revolution changed all of that. Sedentary living and agricultural surplus, it sparked the inevitable rise of urban centers and empires. And that's where the archaeological record shows us a sharp increase in large-scale organized violence or war. The 20th century alone, according to Eric Hobsbawm, was the most murderous in recorded history. He reminds us warfare took the lives of some 187 million people in the 20th century alone. I mean, at first, 20th century warfare was essentially limited to interstate conflict and civil wars. But now, in the 21st century, armed conflict, it's no longer in the exclusive hands of governments and states. In fact, 21st century warfare permeates our civilian lives. And that's a major change. You see, at the turn of the 20th century, only 5% of combat casualties, on average, were civilian. By the end of World War II, however, we see the tide has turned. Around 2/3 of World War II casualties were civilian deaths. And believe it or not, that figure has only risen. Today, well, it's around 90%. That is to say, 90% of those who die in 21st century war, they're civilians. Ultimately, warfare as we know it today is a truly modern phenomenon. And the pervasive armed conflict we see in our lives, it's fundamentally different from previous wars. So, war is a rather recent phenomenon when we consider the long arc of Homo sapiens history. So, let's turn to our second myth, the idea that we are biologically predisposed to violence. Now, famous scholars like Hobbes and Darwin, they're not alone in thinking that we humans are hardwired towards aggression and violence. In fact, many researchers have traced this tendency to our primate cousins. Primatologist Richard Wrangham, for example, he studies what he calls coalition killing among non-human species. And he finds that other animals, like chimpanzees, they do participate in coalition killings. Now, these killings involve bands of chimps collectively carrying out violent attacks on rival groups, which sounds a lot like warfare, doesn't it? Wrangham explains that coalition killings are an expression of dominance. But is that the full story? Are we programmed for conflict? Well, in some ways it appears so. Yet, there might be other biological factors at work that show us that we're not predestined for violence and war. In his book, Demonic Males, Wrangham shows that chimpanzees, like some humans, beat, rape, and kill other chimpanzees. We've even observed them drinking the blood of their victims. But let's not take this predilection of our chimpanzee cousins as an inevitable dimension of our own biological being. Why? Well, Wrangham reminds us to look at bonobo apes too. And he shows us that chimpanzees and bonobos have much different lives despite their shared genetics. Unlike the violence we see in chimpanzees and gorillas, bonobos are the free-loving hippies of the ape family. Bonobo males, they do occasionally become aggressive and violent, but they rarely kill or rape. Why is that? Well, Wrangham explains that tight-knit bands of female bonobos, they actually gang up on and attack male counterparts who act up. Ultimately, Wrangham, he prescribes a little bonobo living as a remedy for our 21st century conflict. You see, he argues that if humans emulated bonobos in terms of increasing the political power and voice of women, our species can suppress excess male aggression. Now, another primatologist, Frans de Waal, he's found that among chimpanzees, attraction between opponents actually increases after a fight. Apparently make-up sex isn't necessarily a human invention. And our propensity for conflict resolution, now that may be every bit as powerful as any inclination to fight. Anthropologist Carolyn Nordstrom, she documented this phenomenon amongst humans in her Civil War ethnography, Mozambique, A Different Kind of War. And in her timely study, Nordstrom looked deeper into unfathomable violence and aggression of 15 years of war. She connects us with soldiers, with wartime profiteers, and even ordinary people. And remarkably, she revealed the unrelenting and pervasive propensity for cooperation amongst ordinary people in the face of extraordinary violence. And in an astonishing refusal to accept a life of war and violence, it's ordinary people who created ways to actively socialize combatants back into a life of nonviolence. They actually established a network of healers, and they even resorted to kidnapping soldiers. They kidnapped and reconditioned them towards nonviolence. So it's apparent that there are some biological mechanisms at work in the history of human warfare. But we've also discovered that biologically and culturally, we're equally, or perhaps more inclined towards making peace, not war. And now for our third and final war myth, the idea that war is universal. Even in an era where gun violence impacts our daily lives, we have brothers and sisters on our family tree who make peace seem as inevitable as war. Take the Amish, for example. I grew up in Ohio, not far from a thriving Amish community, and the Amish, they refuse to fight in wars. They don't even take disputes to court unless all internal efforts to resolve a conflict have failed. One of the core Amish beliefs is the doctrine of non-resistance. So as Christians, they walk the walk when it comes to the Sermon on the Mount. They turn the other cheek. Similarly, in India, we find the Jain religion, which sees the path to peace as our ultimate purpose. In the words of Lord Mahavira, one weapon will always be stronger than the other, but the path of ahimsa, or peace, it remains unsurpassed. Ascetic Jain monks, they even go to the extreme of sweeping a path as they walk, just to avoid stepping on small, unsuspecting insects. You see, all Jains, they practice peace by fostering goodwill towards others, based on the unity and the sanctity of all life. Now, this worldview, it's endured since the 6th century BCE. And like the Amish, Jains may live in a world of armed conflict, but they don't participate. Now, a final group from southern Africa can get us an even closer look at a human society that makes peace, not war. This is the San of the Kalahari region. They are super sharers. Now, they're one of the oldest indigenous populations on Earth, tracing back their cultural history some 20,000 years. Now, with only a few dozen remaining villages, most of this hunter-gatherer population has transitioned into sedentary farming lifestyles. But nonetheless, their peaceful foraging legacy, it remains. The San, they're known as peaceful people who discourage fighting and aggression, and even competition. Anthropologists, they explain the peaceful lives of the San in part by looking at the lives of their children. You see, in this cooperative, transient lifestyle, there are fewer children around, and these kids, they don't really see much aggression as they're growing up. Typically, San bands only have around a dozen plus children of all ages at any given time. And with such a small crew, competitive games and team sports, they're just less feasible than cooperative activities. So, remarkably, the San have no living memory of fighting over territory, no living memory of war. Richard Lee, he studied the San for over 3 years, and in all, he recorded only 58 actual arguments, of which 34 became physical fights. Put another way, in 3 years, this tight-knit crew sees a physical fight less than once a month and a single argument only about once every 3 weeks. And that's not per person, that's the whole community. So, if we look to our past, and even to groups like the Amish and the San, we learned that war itself is A, a relatively recent phenomenon, B, not biologically inevitable, and C, it isn't universal. If anything, we've seen that humans are wired for conflict resolution, not just coalition killing. Even non-human primates demonstrate their inclination towards reconciliation. So, for this final segment of our lecture, let's take a closer look at this idea of humans as peacemakers. Let's see some cross-cultural examples of conflict resolution strategies to see how people transcend violence and aggression elsewhere in the world. Once a thriving global empire, today the Republic of Mali suffers from extreme poverty and a terribly complex security crisis that will probably take decades to repair. Nonetheless, I want to bring you back to Mali, not to discuss the ongoing conflict there, but because thousands and thousands of rural Malian villages, they show us two terrific daily practices that, again, foster peace over conflict. First, joking cousins. In Mali, my name is Solo Sangare. Solo is the name of my adoptive Malian father, and Sangre, that's our shared family name. And every time I go to our neighboring village for the weekly market day, my tea and sugar guy, Chemogo Dumbia, he always greets me with a lively insult, and it's usually something about flatulence. And you know what? He's insulted if I don't engage in a short round of exchanging barbs. I'm kind of known there for slinging insults about eating donkey meat, but I think you'd probably have to be there to find any of this humorous. You see, it's not that we hate each other. In fact, that's the exact opposite of what's really going on here. We're terrific friends. But he's a Dumbia, traditionally a blacksmith's name. And me, I'm a Sangre. We're herders. And we Sangres and Dumbias, we've long been joking cousins. These two families, we've exchanged friendly insults and laughs for generations. But God help you if you try to join in without being a Sangre or Dumbia. You see, every family name in Mali has a joking cousin alliance. And anthropologists, they interpret this cultural phenomenon as a safety valve that prevents enduring conflict. And more broadly, there's another safety valve that promotes unity over conflict. And this is one of my favorite parts of daily life in the village. It's the village meeting. See, Malians, they do meetings that can include very heated exchanges, but when it comes time for an actual meeting, there's a protocol that diminishes the chance that things will get really out of hand. In fact, the meeting protocol itself is an act of consensus building. Now, these meetings, they always start slow. As the elders, they walk to the chief's hut. Everyone brings a goatskin mat to sit on in a loose oval pattern, and with all parties facing each other. Now, when I did my first village meeting to ask permission to live and study with this community, this is how it went down. The elders, they were seated, surrounded by all these onlookers who often chime in when appropriate. Then, my host brother Brahma, he addressed the chief and elders explaining that I'd like to speak to them. And even though every one of us heard that message, the junior-most elder thanked Brahma, and then, right in front of us, he proceeded to repeat exactly what Brahma had said, but he said it to the next elder in order of age. Now, some elders add a couple lines, some even take a few away. But by the time the last elder gives this redundant message directly to the chief, everyone has had their opportunity to add their voice to the discussion. And if you're into quick meetings, stay the heck away from the village, because now the chief will initiate the message chain again, explaining that I may continue with my actual question. And once that message is passed down out loud through each elder, the final elder, right, the youngest one, gives that message back to my brother Brahma, who in turn gives it to me. But remember, I heard that message each and every time, all the way from the chief to Brahma and then back. Now, this process continued, and up and down the line, we settled our business. Now, when I asked the chief later about the meeting protocol, he explained that it allows everyone to be heard, and that it brings everyone together in the spirit of compromise, or, in moments of conflict, reconciliation. Now, leaving Mali, let's stay in West Africa and head to Liberia, where we'll meet the Kapeli people. and a conflict resolution practice that they call the Capelli Moot, or in local language, Bere Mumenesa. Now, the Capelli, they're hardworking rural rice and peanut farmers, and their small, close-knit communities have a great method for resolving conflict. Now, unlike the U.S. justice system that deploys court hearings to mete out justice through punishment like fines or jail time, the Capelli, they're more interested in reconciliation rather than retribution-style justice. When an offense threatens the social harmony within a Capelli village, the entire community comes together to hold a moot. Now, the moot forum, it takes place in someone's home rather than a courthouse. You see, the complainant who calls for the moot, they'll select a family member to serve as a mediator. But really, there's no singular judge or jury. In the moot, everyone chimes in. The conflicting parties, they directly question and challenge each other, and the mediator and audience, they join in. And by the end of this long discussion, the person deemed at fault publicly apologizes and presents a small gift or two to the aggrieved, who, in turn, offers a smaller gift to help repair that relationship. Then, the guilty party picks up the tab and provides enough rum or beer so that everyone can, well, share a drink. Now, similar mediation rituals, they're found elsewhere in Africa, and anthropologists, they attribute this form of reconciliatory justice as unique for small-scale societies. You see, in a small rural cooperative community, people simply can't afford enduring conflict. It undermines the social harmony required to make a living off the land. So, rather than developing a justice system that locks up people who are desperately needed for fetching water or farming rice, the Capelli Moot, it vets justice while maintaining the social network that ensures the village's bellies remain full. So, let's keep with our cross-cultural case studies of conflict resolution, but for our last example, we'll head to Afghanistan to see how the U.S. military has used anthropology to better understand the socio-cultural dimensions of Afghan communities. Now, anthropology in the military, it's not a new thing, but not everybody really agrees that it's a good idea. You see, back in the 1960s, the U.S. government, they launched Project Camelot, based at American University. Now, Project Camelot was a counterinsurgency study led by anthropologists and other social and behavioral scientists. And the big idea was to better predict and perhaps influence social movements in other countries. The logic was that U.S. national security was threatened by insurgencies all throughout the world, and particularly in neighboring Latin America. So, the orchestrators of Project Camelot, they brought in some anthropology, because insurgencies, they signaled a breakdown of social order. And the military, they wanted to better understand the social and cultural processes that lead to these transformative events. Shortly after the true purpose and funding source was discovered by collaborating Latin American scholars, the military shut down this program, but evidence shows that similar work, it continued nevertheless. Prominent anthropologists like Margaret Mead and Marshall Solins were so affronted by this military co-opting of anthropology, particularly in Latin America and in Southeast Asia, that they helped pass a stern resolution by the American Anthropological Association. Simply put, they made it clear that anthropologists should not participate in what they labeled clandestine intelligence work. And that's why in 2007, the American Anthropological Association once again spoke up about the militarization of anthropology. Specifically, they were reacting to a new military project operating in Afghanistan. It was called the Human Terrain System. The 2007 statement, it was clear that this HTS violated the American Anthropology Association's Code of Ethics, which mandates that we do no harm to our research subjects. Now, one thing that especially raised ethical concerns was that, unlike previous militarized applications of anthropology, the human terrain teams, they put anthropologists in actual war zone combat units. They could carry weapons alongside other more conventionally trained soldiers. The goal, however, was for the anthropologists to help soldiers and local populations communicate and understand each other. One example would be the Yurga. Now, the Yurga, a community's council of elders, well, that was a setting in which community members, they built consensus with guidance and discussion of Muslim values and teachings. And anthropologists, they helped the U.S. military recognize the importance of these civic conversations. And they brought combat units and communities together, winning friends through understanding and collaborative social projects like building schools, or maybe helping elders deal with problems ranging from food security to fears of being attacked. And the short of it is that the primary rationale for deploying human terrain teams in both Iraq and Afghani war zones was to curtail casualties by winning the hearts and minds of local communities. And to an extent, they did. But the program, it quickly faltered after critiques of mismanagement and dubious behavior compounded with a serious challenge by professional anthropologists across the nation. In reaction to the Human Terrain System program, the American Anthropological Association, they made it clear. Now, they weren't averse to the idea of reducing casualties, but they were genuinely concerned by the fact that anthropologists working in combat units clearly violated our disciplinary code of ethics. Specifically, critics questioned the voluntary subject's ability to decline participation in the team's anthropology work. After all, if a guy with a gun came to my door and asked if I'd agree to join him for an interview, I'm thinking that gun, it's going to work better than a pretty please. And I'd say yes, even if it was against my wishes. Maybe deep down I'm worried that anti-US forces will see me talking with these soldiers, and when they leave, my family could be killed or tortured. I mean, similarly, if any of the information war zone anthropologists produce is used by the military for the purpose of designing combat campaigns and identifying potential targets, then the participating anthropologists, they're in clear violation of our code of ethics. Their work, it directly alters the winds of war, and this can undermine the work of all anthropologists abroad. I mean, the last thing a field researcher needs is to be accused of being a meddling intelligence officer. At its peak, the HTS, it employed some 500 people who served in 30 teams deployed in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and at a cost of over $725 million. But once the majority of U.S. troops were pulled out of these theaters, the HTS program was officially closed in 2014. But it's likely that we'll see new forms of anthropology in combat zones and elsewhere in the military because, despite the controversy, the generic idea of a military with cultural knowledge of the people they engage with, it's become essential. And I gotta tell you, I found that over time, more and more of my students side with the HTS concept, arguing that the potential to save lives makes the compromise worthwhile. Others, however, they do challenge this position in the spirit of our anthropological code of ethics. Regardless, it's always a thoughtful and important discussion. So with that, let's wrap up our anthropological exploration of conflict and reconciliation. Deep in our bones, we typically interpret as scary and threatening that which is unfamiliar and unrecognizable. And those feelings, they can quickly escalate into a maelstrom of violent behavior and, of course, even war. But through biology, language, and culture, anthropologists help us render the unfamiliar familiar, or, as Ruth Benedict once said, to make the world safe for human differences. Today, we saw how humankind has a wealth of cultural and even biological resources that we can use to transform conflict into reconciliation and harmony. And in a conflict-ridden world where 90% of wartime deaths are civilian casualties, we'd do well to build on what we've learned about the anthropology of war in order to develop an anthropology of conflict resolution too. Let's spread the word.